Welcome to Disneyland. It's a pleasure to be here this morning to welcome you to ICRP 2017. This is a very important conference, an important opportunity to bring so many radiation protection experts from around the world together. Let me begin by thanking the organizers from ICRP and European platforms for all the hard work that went into this. Many people worked many hours to make this conference happen. And I think I can tell from the attendance here today that it's been very successful. So Jean-Christophe and the people that worked with him and supporting this activity in Paris, congratulations. We're very pleased with the outcome. As one of the sponsors of this conference, I wanted to highlight that we're very much pleased to be able to play a role in this conference, and really a role with the ICRP over many years. The NEA has been engaged with the ICRP in many ways over many different opportunities for many years, and we think the relationship has been a very good one and one we hope to continue and enhance. What I'd like to do today is to highlight a few thoughts that I've had about radiation protection issues and things I think that many of you will be thinking about and talking about over the next couple of days, but also things that we need to work on together going forward. To begin, I'll give you a quick introduction to the NEA because I think some of you may not be as familiar with the NEA as some others. The NEA is an organization of governments. Today we're 33 governments that include our two newest members, which just joined, Romania and Argentina, which became members of the NEA just in the last few months. We are an organization that brings experts together from the highly developed, highly experienced organizations from member countries that have the deepest experience with nuclear technology, nuclear science, radiation protection, and other areas. Our mission is to foster cooperation among our memberships to try to solve difficult problems, to try to bring together the experts to work together to come to common positions and common agreement on how to go forward with important issues associated with safety and science. We conduct joint research together in a variety of areas, including radiation protection, and I'll highlight a few areas in just a moment. As part of our framework, we have a lot of separately funded activities beyond what's contributed by our member countries. We're the host of the Generation 4 International Forum, which has been around for about 15 or 16 years to develop next generation nuclear technologies. The Multinational Design Evaluation Program, which has been bringing together top regulators from around the world to look at state-of-the-art technologies such as the AP1000, the EPR, the VVR technologies, the most recent design, to make sure that regulators are asking the same questions to gain the same information about these advanced technologies. International Framework for Nuclear Energy Cooperation joined us about 2 years ago and is a framework that brings together the highly developed countries such as France, Japan, the United States, alongside with countries that aspire to deploy nuclear power in the future, such as Turkey and African countries and countries in Southeast Asia. And they bring together conversations about financial issues about nuclear power, as well as what to do with nuclear waste and whether to build multinational repositories. And as I mentioned, we also have joint projects. We have had many joint projects over many years, including the Halden Reactor Project, which I think many of you are familiar with. Much of our work circulates among these standing technical committees. These are committees of experts that have been identified by their countries to come together at the NEA to discuss difficult issues. We have two committees that focus on nuclear safety, the CSNI, which actually Jean-Christophe is currently the chair, the CNRA, the Committee on Nuclear Regulatory Activities, which brings together top regulators to talk about policy level issues in nuclear safety, Radioactive Waste Management Committee, CRPPH, which I'll talk about again in a moment, which brings together the top radiation protection experts identified by their countries to talk about radiation protection issues, but also Nuclear Law Committee, the Nuclear Development Committee, the NDC, Nuclear Science Committee, and also we host the Nuclear Data Bank, the NEA Data Bank, which is a library of computer codes and nuclear data that's used around the world by researchers. But we're here today to talk about radiation protection, so I'm going to focus on CRPPH, the Committee on Radiation Protection and Public Health, which currently is chaired by by Mike Boyd of the U.S. EPA, who is here in the audience today. Mike, where are you? Would you wave up, Mike? Mike is a real pleasure to work with. The CRPPH is staffed by the NEA to facilitate conversations among the members. Ted Lazo has been the senior radiation protection expert at the NEA for more than 20 years. I don't know, Ted, where are you? Please wave, Ted. Ted is back. Many of you know Ted. And he is working very closely with Ovidio Guzman, who is going to be taking over as secretary of that group. Why don't you wave, Ovidio? And all this is overseen in a division of the NEA, the Division of Radiation Protection and Human Aspects of Nuclear Safety. Yanni Ha is the head of that, and she's sitting up front. Yanni, please wave. This group has been around for many, many years and is really the core of many of all the radiation protection activities we do within the NEA, and is a group that is also very well equipped to take on some of the very difficult questions that face us today. One thing I will highlight about the CRPPH is it is currently, and I think there's going to be a meeting this week to talk about it, developing an international radiological protection school, which we're very excited about, which will not be so much a school of teaching people how to calculate dose, but really will be a school to give people a greater context about the legal and policy framework that led to the radiation protection system we have today. I want to highlight a few things, and some of this I think will be issues that the CRPPH will be discussing over in this upcoming meetings. But as you heard from Jacques Repisard and also from Jean-Christophe Neal, there's a lot of research that's going on in the area of radiation protection. And this research has been going on for many, many decades. And so we do know a lot of things. But one area that is persistently an area of discussion and debate is what happens at the lower dose end. What happens in the below 50 millisievert end of the dose exposure spectrum? What are the health effects, and how do we deal with those? How do we regulate those? And as many of you know, before coming to the NEA, I was a commissioner with the U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission. And these issues were always very much on our minds, and we worked very closely to read the recommendations from the ICRP and from other areas of research to try to make regulatory decisions. But what we found was that there was a point where the science simply didn't give us enough information to make what we would like, the kinds of rigorous decisions we would always like to make. We were left with a lot of inexact science in some ways when it came to the lower doses. And as a result, radiological protection and safety decisions often were left in a very gray policy space, which I'll talk about. Obviously, the world has adopted the LMT model. There is some debate about this in some corners, but it's a model that is protective of public health and safety given the uncertainties. We assume that any exposure is bad, any exposure will cause some harm, and we regulate on that basis. We do, however, take into account economic, sociological, and beneficial use. We don't say we have zero radiation risk, because it is good to have industrial sources, to have medical exposures, to have nuclear power facilities operating. It's a net public benefit to have these activities going on. So we don't say that no exposure is the requirement. But as we make protective decisions, we get into this issue about, well, are we being prudent enough? Should we go have lower doses? Or do we have the right balance? Or is it possible, as many people argue, particularly in industry, that we've already gone too far, that we already are overly protective, and that low doses that we protect people against are much, much less harmful than other things that are in society? This is something that comes up very often in the radiological protection discussions among regulators. And of course, there are many issues that we run into. I won't go through all these issues in detail today, but you're familiar with all these debates and all these discussions about, how do we regulate these doses? How do we take into account the difference between worker doses and public doses? How do we mitigate the risk to children? What do we do about various organs? These discussions continue, and ICRP has given a lot of good advice about many of these, but there's still a lot of work to be done in these areas. But it comes back to this issue of whether there's risk to dose or not. What we do know is that when you get below 100 or so millisieverts, we have a hard time finding where the risk increase is. We don't see it on a regular basis. We have seen many, many animal studies. I've read a lot of research with animal studies from all over the world, and we have a very difficult time finding where the risks are at these low doses. But at the same time, the uncertainty persists. We also, as I think Jacques Rapissard mentioned, we also have questions about the impact from organ to organ and also from person to person. This is something we will do research about in the future. What we don't know is actually much more impactful than what we do know. We don't really understand the exact mechanism of how cancer is created in various cells. We don't understand chronic exposure versus acute exposure and whether it's a difference or not. We don't understand the biomarkers reliably. There's a lot of questions about that. And this issue about the LNT model, is there really a threshold below which radiation just simply doesn't matter? Or, as you hear what some people would say, is there a threshold at which radiation is actually good for you? These are issues that we have to do research in because these are the questions that will guide us going into the future. Whatever happens in various countries with the future of nuclear power, no matter how many plants are operated, radiation will be in our society really for as far as the eye can see, for both energy use, for medical exposure, for industrial use. We will always have radiation around, and trying to understand that is going to be a very, very important part of the scientific endeavor going forward. So these questions persist, and until the science is completely clear, and I don't know that it'll ever be completely clear, we have to recognize that making protective action decisions is not just a matter of science, it's also a matter of society. And this is something that has become more and more a part of our lives as people who work in this field, because decision makers and have to take into account not just the science, but also the mores, the expectations of society. Now, let me pause just simply to say that I don't think that means that we take a vote to see if we want to have a certain exposure or not. What it means is we take into account societal expectations. It is not the basis for making decisions, but it should inform our decisions. And how we get that information to have informed decisions has actually become a very complex matter, something we've worked a lot within the context of the NEA. Public consultation, stakeholder engagement has to be part of the decision making, and that's something that we spend a lot of time talking about. So what we see is radiological protection and social science must be brought together to make decisions. This is something that is self-evident for regulators. It happens all the time. But how it happens, I think, is really different from country to country. And it's an area where we could probably do better to try to have a little more uniform approach. What we've learned over the years is the prevailing circumstances frame how stakeholders look at radiation protection issues. If you're building a nuclear power plant and it's bringing value to an economy, people look at the possible radiation exposure one way. If you're decommissioning a nuclear power plant, they look at it a different way. If there's a nuclear accident, they look at it a third way. The prevailing circumstances matter. RP decisions reflect the realities of the situation at hand. If you have a radiological accident, the exposures you expect people to take are going to be different than the exposures they would assume in normal operations. We always have to focus on optimization. And I think this is a term that has been used and misused a lot over the years, but I think this audience understands how to use the term correctly, so I won't try to belabor that. But achieving optimization is an essential part of the radiological protection business. Understanding where the balance is something that is very difficult, but you have to bring together both the science, the prevailing circumstances, the stakeholder engagement in order to make decisions that stand the test of time and will be accepted by society. There's very little point in making decisions from a radiological standpoint that are unenforceable, and that's something that we have to take into account. So this issue of how to get the stakeholder views involved is actually quite difficult, and it's something that's faced by countries around the world. Earlier this year, the NEA held a workshop, and I think there were people in this room that participated in this, where we brought 140 senior governmental experts together to talk about how they engage the public in making decisions and how they engage the public in radiological protection decisions and plant decisions about whether to build a nuclear power plant or to mine uranium or any other radiological area. And we brought these people together and they had very intensive discussions and roundtables. And just very quickly, a couple of the findings that we came from this is first, that everyone recognized that this is a big challenge and no one thought they had the right answer, but they also recognized there's no one-size-fits-all approach, that every country, every situation is going to be different. But one thing that I think we all came to conclude was that whatever your engagement is, you have to be prepared to spend a lot of time on it. It cannot be done quickly, it cannot be done cheaply, it has to be a very resource-intensive activity. But time is a good thing. Time is your friend, it's not your enemy. If these decisions take a long time to work through, that's fine, because you're educating the public as you go forward. A few other points that were raised. Young generation should be involved in a lot of these decisions. This was something that we found to be very much part of this conversation. But as I mentioned earlier, stakeholder involvement is not a vote. It informs decision makers, but it's not a popularity contest. You can't approach it that way. Looking at a very extremist situation, I congratulate the ICRP for the very successful dialogue sessions they've held in Fukushima Prefecture. I've participated in one of these dialogues myself and found it very rewarding. It's very, very interesting to see how when people spend the time because of their circumstances to learn about radiation, how sophisticated they become very quickly and how the fear disappears as the level of sophistication goes up. Doesn't mean these people are completely comfortable, but they understand the challenge and they understand how to balance the risks and rewards associated with living in Fukushima Prefecture and how to eat food and where to walk and where not to walk. These conversations we found to be very important. But these dialogues were a way of educating the public over a long period of time, and I think really serve as a good model for how to engage the public in a very intensive situation. A less intensive situation pops up when we look at the issue of nuclear waste disposal, and we have the Forum on Stakeholder Confidence, which I think is another good model, which brings together international experts along with national experts to go to work with public groups, NGOs, just members of the public who are interested in radiation protection and nuclear waste disposal, to answer questions and talk about what is going on around the world and what is going on in their country. Not to convince them of one solution or another, but simply to build confidence that what they're hearing makes sense and is accepted globally. This is another good model that we think has been working very well. We recently held one of these conferences just last year in Bern, Switzerland, as part of the Swiss government's effort to cite nuclear waste repositories. And we found this conversation to be very fruitful. And one that was very interesting in that the Swiss also brought in about 15 or 16 very young people that were 25 or younger, to engage in the conversation, to talk about how young people receive information and understand information about radiation, about nuclear waste, and issues related to that. It's very interesting. So I'm going to conclude with just a few things that I think that this group and really the larger community should be thinking about over the next months and years. Some of these are pet peeves of mine, so you'll have to pardon me. One is, ICRP has said for quite some time the collective dose in terms of person sieverts cannot be proactively used to predict the number of expected deaths. Nevertheless, regulatory organizations around the world, including the US NRC, use this measure of latent cancer fatalities. I think it's a completely irresponsible practice that we should end. This group, I think, should take on that discussion, and we can have that debate, but my personal opinion is that it does a lot more harm than good, and it doesn't inform the public very well. So if we don't use a measure like that, then how do we engage the public? I think that's a really good question. I think we really have to spend more time thinking about how do we engage the public in full communications and in order to have an optimization discussion. And I think this is something ICRP has already touched on over the years. I think we have to do more in this area. I think this is a very, very important area of consideration. At the same time, how we communicate radiological risk is a discussion that we have already started within the NEA, and I know many of you have also had this conversation, recognizing that the public, when they hear about the number of sieverts of exposure or the becquerels or the grays or other measures, that they have absolutely no idea what we're talking about. That is a big problem for us. And one thing, even though I'm down to my last 42 seconds, I will point to is during discussions in Fukushima Prefecture, I talked to a lady who was an evacuee, and she talked about the wealth of information was available on websites in Japan about the situation in Fukushima Prefecture. And she said, quite frankly, I look at it, and she says, I don't understand any of it, so it doesn't mean anything to me. That's a failure. It's not her failure, it's our failure. And it's something we should be thinking about very carefully. Finally, and I'm going to echo Jean-Christophe and Jacques Repisard on this point, research, research, research. We have to do more. I'm very pleased with what I hear is going on in the European platforms, but I think even globally we can do even more. There should be even more intensive effort in this area because it's so important to get this right, and it's so important that I think it's some of the best money we can spend as governments to have an intensive effort, an intensive global effort to solve these problems and to enable us to have more definitive answers on the effect of low doses of radiation. So with that, again, I won't be here for the whole conference. I'm going to hang around a lot this morning and a little bit this afternoon, but I wish you a fruitful and productive conference and discussions over the next couple of days, and we look forward to working with all of you going into the future. Thank you very much.